hey, there are all of these countries and states that rank really poorly in terms of economic freedom. How do we make them look better? Like, what can we tell people and policymakers, to improve in terms of economic freedom?
Hello, welcome to another episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on a guest who knows a lot about economic freedom, how it influences women and men, and how different that may be over time. And she's done a lot of other research on a lot of other areas. And it's none other than Meg Tuszynski. Meg, welcome to Let People Prosper show.
Vance, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a regular listener, so I'm just thrilled to be here.
Awesome. And I hope you said your last name right. We've known each other for years, and as I was preparing, I was like, wait a minute, do I know how to say her name? But is it Tuszynski? Is that how you say it?
Tuszynski, you nailed it.
All right, good. Perfect. All right, well, we've got a lot to talk about, but before we get into all that, for the audience, let me go ahead and give them your bio, and we'll jump into it. So, Meg is the managing director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom in the Cox School of Business at the Southern Methodist University, and a research assistant professor at the Cox School. Meg's research interests primarily fall into two categories. One category seeks to understand the causes and consequences of variations in economic freedom across nations, states, and localities. The other seeks to advance our understanding of entangled political economy, which analyze the inextricable intertwining, I like those words together, of commercial and political interest. Meg has published research in Public Choice, the Southern Economic Journal, the Journal of Entrepreneurship and Public Policy, and many more. She has also published popular pieces in many outlets, and she's just a great person to talk to overall. So, the first question I ask every guest that comes on, Meg, is why do you do what you do every day?
Yeah, absolutely. I work on an index of economic freedom, work with indices of economic freedom. That's the key thing we do at the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom. So if you've seen I know you've seen Vance, but if your listeners have seen the Fraser Institute Index of Economic Freedom that measures rates and ranks economic freedom across countries, or the one that rates and ranks economic freedom across states, we have the lead authors of those indices, Bob Lawson and Dean Stansel, in-house at the Bridwell Institute. And so we help update those indices each year, and then we do lots and lots of research that says, if a country or a state is more economically free, what are the implications? Do they grow faster or experience lower levels of poverty? Things like that. And what got me into this world and keeps me motivated each day to understand these relationships is really having experienced the polar ends of the spectrum for economic freedom. So I grew up in Illinois, not really known as a place for being particularly economic free. As a matter of fact, we have in Illinois, one of the highest rates of people flooding out of the states, of out-migration, because of things like punishing tax policy, regulations that just don't make sense and don't keep businesses there. A government that's highly paternalistic. And my parents are small business owners. They own a restaurant in Illinois. I've owned this restaurant for about 30 years now. It's a really, really cool place. But, I grew up seeing the implications of those restrictions. And I live in Texas now, where I see the other end of that spectrum. We don't have a state income tax. Regulations are there. No state is perfect, but much more reasonable than Illinois. The government is less paternalistic. And where do companies go when they leave places like Illinois and California? They're coming to places like Texas and Florida, which are much higher in the sort of economic freedom scale. I love Illinois. I've told people again and again, I would still be in Illinois if it made sense to be in Illinois. It just doesn't make economic sense to be there. And so all my family is still back there. I have a lot of friends back there. And so that's really what keeps me motivated. And I really think about what I'm doing as following in sort of Adam Smith's footsteps. His major book was an inquiry into the causes and consequences of the wealth of nations. And really one of the big things we're trying to do at the Institute is say, hey, there are all of these countries and states that rank really poorly in terms of economic freedom. How do we make them look better? Like, what can we tell people and policymakers, to improve in terms of economic freedom? And it isn't just that the index itself is important. It is, but there are literally decades of research now that dig into, if a state is more economically free or a country is more economically free, it grows faster. There are lower levels of poverty. Like there are all of these wonderful good outcomes that we get when these places are more economically free. And so my personal experience growing up in Illinois and then now living in Texas has really helped me, it really hits home those implications of economic freedom and variations of economic freedom.
Yeah, no, it's excellent. And your work has exemplified what you've been able to find through that, not only in your own life, but in your research and everything else. And I've been fortunate to have both Bob Lawson, who does the world, different countries, and Dean Stanzel looking at economic freedom on the states. And so it's great to kind of bring all this together with having you on the program as well to talk about these things. And I wonder, whenever you talk to your parents or your experience in Illinois and then you coming to Texas, what have been some of the key factors that, and you talk about this from your research as well, but what are some of the key factors that maybe hold Illinois back compared to Texas? And even from a personal standpoint, I mean, you've got kids now and everything, and you see some of these things. How can that influence people's lives along the way?
I love this question. When I tell people are flooding out of places like Illinois because these low levels of economic freedom, the common pushback I get is, well, people aren't looking at your index when they're deciding to leave these states. But the index of economic freedom at the state level is made up of government spending, taxes, and labor market regulations. And Illinois ranks poorly in all three areas of those. And those are things that people consider when they're deciding to live somewhere. They look at taxes. There's no state income tax in Texas. That's one reason that keeps me here and keeps me away from Illinois or elsewhere. Labor market regulations. Again, my parents own a small business, and businesses who are subjected to onerous labor market regulations will often choose someplace else to do business. My parents are right on the border of Illinois and Indiana. This beautiful old, pre-Civil War home. It's a cool area. But as regulations and restrictions continue to get more onerous, I keep saying, why don't you just jump the border?
Yeah.
It's right over here. It's a lot more reasonable. But you can't pick up a whole, pre-Civil War home and move it across the border. So they're kind of stuck there. But that's what's so phenomenally sad to me is policy choices are choices. And the state government could make better ones. And so that's, again, why I do what I do, is trying to figure out why these wonderful places are losing people. California is another great example. My husband goes there frequently for work. California is beautiful. It is a wonderful place, but people are flooding out of the state because of those poor policy decisions.
Yeah. It's a tough decision, too, about leaving your state, the home state of Illinois in your case. My home state is Texas. I don't plan to move anywhere, but you never know. We'll see. But even from other countries too, right? I had Veronique de Rougy recently talking about her leaving in '99 from France to come to America. And sometimes it boggles my mind to think about how much incentive, how much displeasure you're having in your place where you're living, in Illinois in this case, to move to Texas, to move to somewhere else, because you give up a lot of your you don't give it up, but there's your past, the things that you're comfortable with, of being entrepreneurial and taking that risk to go somewhere else. And so that's why I think the economic freedom index is so important, because it really is telling us about this connection between big government in this case and smaller government, and how that is a big factor in why people are leaving. I mean, if you start to look at the places that people are leaving, we mentioned some of those like Illinois and California, but also New York and some other states, and where they're moving to, places like Florida, Tennessee, Texas, New Hampshire, some of the top ranking states with no income tax, by the way, personal income tax. I think it really tells a lot more to where you're able to bring on some of that and personalize it so well, that I think are so important, Meg, because if not, the system of federalism that we have in America, which is one of the best things that I think that we're able to design, in the institutional framework that we live in here from our family fathers and everything else, and it goes back some to Adam Smith as well. But you have this kind of mainline economics that has helped us to get to where we are today, and if we're not looking at how to improve people's lives, then we're going to be in a situation of more poverty and less prosperity. And the name of this show, The Let People Prosper, is to allow for that to happen. But I wonder, with some of your research, and I was just looking up for the latest, and this comes out every year, Economic Freedom of North America index, where Illinois ranks 35th, and Texas ranks 4th, for example. Shows a huge difference. What are some of the others, things that you like to highlight about this, about what your research has done in the past?
I like to my own research. There's my own research, and then there's all of the research on economic freedom, and they're kind of intertwined. One of my most recent papers with Bob Lawson and Vince Miazzi is literally going through and coding a whole bunch of research, all of the research that's been done recently on economic freedom across countries. And so, I think one of the big things that I like to highlight is we literally have decades of research now on the implications of economic freedom. And we have found so many positive correlations and very few negative correlations between economic freedom and things that we think of as being good. Economic freedom, growth in economic freedom is the strongest relationship there is. Places that are more economically free grow faster. Investment, places that are more economically free tend to realize more investment. There are lower levels of corruption. There are lower levels of poverty. There's some suggestion that the environment is cleaner in places that are more economically free. Tyler Cowen had this great little book called Stubborn Attachments, where he argues that for any sort of thing that you think is good in the world that policy could target, economic growth is the way to get there, because places that are, experience more economic growth realize all of those beneficial outcomes. And so what I like to say is, well, how do you get that growth? You push for policies of economic freedom in order to get that growth. So, one of the big things that I do in my own research with Dean Stansel pretty frequently is looking at, there are these relationships that hold in the cross-country literature. Can we tease out those same relationships when we're looking across states instead of across countries? That is nice to understand in and of itself, but also lends some robustness to our findings of economic freedom. And very frequently we find those outcomes. So the last thing that I'll say on this is, in the work that I've done with Bob Lawson and Dean Stansel, sort of looking at all the literature on economic freedom at the cross-country level and at the cross-state level, about 2/3 of the research finds that economic freedom is associated with some good outcome, many of which I just listed. The other third of that research doesn't find that economic freedom is associated with some bad outcome. It just can't tease out a relationship. We found a handful of papers that find economic freedom is associated with something undesirable. And in many cases, there's like some conflicting, outcomes that there's some counterpoint to those papers. And so I always like to say you get a lot of bang for your buck with economic freedom. You could target a specific policy to help reduce poverty, and that would help reduce that one metric. Or you can push for an environment of economic freedom, which we found is associated with reduced poverty and also associated with all of these other wonderful benefits we found in the literature.
Yeah. That's great. And I'll put some of those in the show notes page too, Meg, about y'all's meta-analysis and looking at the different effects, because those are really telling about how important economic freedom is. And just for the audience, again, remember, it's about government spending, different measures there, taxes and the burden of taxes, and then labor market regulations come to some of the key factors that are keeping us from being able to prosper as much as we would like to. And this isn't in a sense of, I'm a classical liberal, and so I want as limited government as possible, but I'm also not an anarchist in the sense that I don't think that there shouldn't be any government, that there should be limited roles for government. And so whenever you're looking at this, from those big three, if you will, the umbrella of the economic freedom, is it relative? I believe it's relative rankings, or I know it is, but there's also the absolute factors that you looked at as well. But when you're going in, what are some of the assumptions maybe that you have?
Our main assumption in this economic freedom work is that people know better than some impersonal third party how to live and conduct their lives. That's what you're doing, and let the people prosper with that word, right? And so I love that you mentioned, though, that another common pushback is sort of the, oh, well, you're just anarchists and want no government sort of pushback. And that's absolutely not the
Yeah.
case. Government serves a very, very important role in protecting property rights, in providing a legal system that can help arbitrate those property rights disputes when they arise, and providing some limited set of public goods. Those things are really important. But there is a point beyond which government ceases to be protective and actually becomes predatory. And that, I think, is one of the big assumptions that we bring into the construction of these indices and the research that these draws on these indices. Is we don't want no government, but we want the government that is there to be effective. And so often when government grows too large, it ceases to be effective, even at those core competencies that it should be effective in. So you look at, we've got the cross-state, cross-country, and even a metro level index of economic freedom. And you look at the places that rank really lowly is not a word, but rank really low in terms of economic freedom. And they're places where government is large, sure, but it's not the size that's the problem. It's the ineffectiveness that's really the problem.
That's a great point. Great point. Let's dig into some of your other research, because some of this can also be a little bit people, different sides, or people are going to say, "Oh no, that's just wrong." Or there's this discussion about how will it affect women, and your research has looked into this. And so I wondered what some of your recent studies on women and economic freedom, what you're finding so far within that research.
Great question. So a couple years ago, we were approached by a donor who was really, really interested in understanding sort of how the economy, the interconnections between women and the economy more broadly. Her name is Angela Brawley. She runs a group called the Policy Circle, or is one of the founders of a group called the Policy Circle, which is a female discussion group, policy discussion group targeted towards women. And there are groups, there are, I think, 500 or something chapters in all states in the US. It's a really cool group. But what we sort of pitched to Angela at that time was something that I'd been thinking of for a long time, was the distributional sort of consequences of economic freedom. So the research that I've talked about, that economic freedom is associated with lower levels of poverty and faster economic growth, and all of these benefits, tend to look at those outcomes for the average person in a population. I think it's also really important to understand, if a rising tide, does it really lift all boats, or does it not? Are there these distributional consequences? And so an easy way to get at that question that has standard data across all countries is, are there different sorts of outcomes for men and women? And this is kind of building on, absolutely building on some work done by Rosemary Fike, who helped incorporate the differential treatment, economic treatment of men and women into the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So what Rosie essentially did was say, hey, men and women don't experience economic freedom to the same extent in many, many countries around the world. There are lots of countries where women can't hold the same sorts of job as men can. Women can't open a bank account without a husband's permission, or travel without a husband's permission, or do all sorts of different things. And so she created a gender disparity index. And we've actively incorporated that into our Economic Freedom of the World report now, to account for those gender differences in many, many countries. There are only 62 countries in the world where men and women are formally equal under the law. In the other 102, 3 countries that we rank in our Economic Freedom Index, there are some differences between men and women. That was a long-winded way of coming back to what I did in my project that was very generously funded by Angela Brawley and the Brawley Family Foundation, was to commission 15 articles on this topic of women and economic freedom. So we could really dig into understanding, is economic freedom good for everyone? Or are there maybe some areas in which women are disadvantaged relative to men? And punchline, no, there are not. Economic freedom is extremely beneficial for women. As a matter of fact, in this world where we're continuing to hear more and more calls for various sorts of gender mandates, those may not be the right way to promote women's opportunities. In fact, pushing for more economic freedom is probably a better way. And I've got 15 studies now to kind of back that up.
Yeah, wow. That's awesome. And I bet it's going to be controversial, though, because some of them are going to probably push back, right?
Oh,
And say, no way that's the case. Because we hear a lot about DEI and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the discussions that are going on there, and universities, and across businesses and government and everything else. And, there's always this discussion about, well, women are being paid on average lower than men. And there's a 77 cents or how many ever cents it is now. But, we know that that's the wrong way to look at it, because you're looking at averages, which you brought up initially. And I wonder, though, how are we going to overcome some of those obstacles? Because I want to let people prosper, whether it's men, women, right? And so how can we make sure that we have enough economic freedom to be able to, because some of the freedom isn't going to be measured in the Economic Freedom North America Index. Like some of the things you were mentioning earlier about women not necessarily having the freedom maybe to vote or to go and get a bank account. That wouldn't necessarily be reflected, I don't think, in your report, but there are probably other measures that you could use to look at that. Is that right?
So actually, the Gender Disparity Index that Rosie Fike helped incorporate into the Economic Freedom of the World report does specifically look at those questions, whether women have freedom to work, whether women have freedom to travel. There are a whole bunch of different things, whether women have the same sorts of property rights or legal status as a man does. Mm-hmm. And so we have actively incorporated at the cross-country level that is reflected in the index.
Got it.
But there are, the benefit of not having everything in the index is you can then use that index to test whether more economic freedom results in these other sorts of beneficial outcomes. And that's essentially what I did in this project. Okay. And just, as you were talking, one of the things that I like to bring up is mandates. The logic of a mandate is so easy to see, right? Like, if you mandate that you need more women on corporate boards, it's mechanical that you will have more women on corporate boards. And so it's easy to say the mandate was successful, right? Economic freedom is a much tougher sell than a mandate is. There's a more sort of roundabout way in which women are benefited. All people are benefited by economic freedom in these ways, and women are benefited as well. And Rosie Fike, again, is another one that helped me understand this so clearly, is that I think we need to sell economic freedom a little bit better. That economic freedom is, in and of itself, a fundamental human freedom. If you can't work without a husband's permission or open a bank account without a husband's permission, that is itself a curtailment on economic freedom. Yeah. And it not only harms women, but it harms all of the people who would benefit from women being able to participate more fully in the economy as well. Yeah. And so economic freedom is itself a fundamental human right. And then it's got all of those wonderful beneficial outcomes that we've found from decades of research now. Yeah. And so that's sort of how I would push back against, yes, a mandate. It's very clear to see. The last thing that I'll say on that, Vance, that mandates, it's unclear whether mandates actually improve the entire environment. Sure, you can point to some very clear, outcomes. More women on corporate boards when you mandate that there need to be more women on corporate boards. But does that really improve the environment for all women? And I think the literature is very unclear on whether everyone is benefited. It's clear to point at some success stories, but one set of our researchers, Abby Hall, and Rosie Fike did a paper on basically running a horse race between economic freedom and gender mandates. And they found in some limited cases, gender mandates could help promote women's participation in the labor force. But they looked at a whole bunch of other indicators, whether women were employers, whether female unemployment. They looked at all of these other things and found that, in fact, economic freedom was associated with all of those other things. And when gender mandates were effective, they worked best in environments that were already economically free. And so that's, I think, again, the logic of mandates, it's so clear. It's an easy political sell. Yeah. But I think you can have both theoretical and empirical reasons for why, in fact, those aren't beneficial for all women, and pushing for an environment in which everyone can flourish, and women are people too, is more beneficial.
Yeah, no, I love it. And it reminds me of the seen versus the unseen. You see that there are a certain number of women that are on these boards, but the unseen is how many more women could be employed, or are they necessarily the most productive to be on that board? What are the longer term effects of some of those decisions that are made over time? And so it really, it also gets to a lot of things that are happening right now, Meg, and I don't want to get too political on this, but I think that we see a lot from across the political spectrum nowadays. The left to the right are wanting more of a top-down approach. I talk a lot on the show about the NatCons who seem to just want certain people in power. And if they can have those people in power, then they can make the decisions going down from that, which I think is the wrong way to go about it. But the progressives have been wanting to do this for a long time too. I mean, their big push has been that women are not getting paid as much as men, and women aren't having as much of a opportunity as men are. But when you dig into the research, like you've been able to do, that hasn't been the case. And women and men tend to make different decisions over time, whether it be the majors that they have, the education that they get, the types of jobs that they're going to take later on. And so there's so much more that's into it, where I love where you're coming from this on economic freedom, because it's like, look, we need men and women to have the freedom to make the decisions that they want to make. I mean, that goes back to Adam Smith's invisible hand. Just let the markets work instead of us trying to come in and choose where people are going to be, because ultimately that's going to be a huge mistake, I think, longer term. And so economic freedom really should be the key part of this, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I'm reminded of one of the papers in our project was by Anne Rathbone Bradley. And you're bringing up the NatCons, reminded me, her paper was inspired. She was in a talk with Orrin Cass, who was arguing that we need to have a subsidy, basically a subsidy to encourage more women to stay at home with their children, because more women in the workforce is destroying the family. And her paper basically said, no, more economic freedom gives women agency over their own lives to decide how they're going to spend their time. You know, more women are in the workforce. Sure, that's a good thing in many ways, but like more economic freedom gives you the choice and more choices as to whether you're going to be in the workforce, to what extent you're going to be in the workforce. And she points specifically to the gig economy. So Claudia Golden is the most recent winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on sort of women's economic opportunities. And one of her big points is that the last chapter of what she calls the grand gender convergence is that women need more flexibility in the workforce. Women are amazing multitaskers, but the sort of traditional workforce isn't set up. Like the 9-to-5 job is not really consistent with being able to go to your kids' soccer games and pick them up from school. But having more sort of flexible work schedules would be really beneficial in helping sort of achieve more gender parity. And so what Anne looks at or talks about in her paper a little bit is the rise of the gig economy and sort of the breaking down of that traditional 9-to-5 schedule that was an outgrowth of COVID really has been disproportionately beneficial for women. And so that's another economic freedom success story. Like, we don't need to encourage women to stay at home. We don't need to encourage more women to go into the workforce. Both are sort of wrongheaded. We need to have economic freedom, and that will allow women to make their own decisions about their lives.
Yeah. Well said. I guess going back to economic freedom and the three big areas, right? Three big issues with government spending and taxes and labor market regulations. You know, some may ask, well, why are each one of those important? Like, how are those really inhibiting women from entering the labor force? But it seems like with government spending, it's got to be paid for somehow. A lot of times it's safety net programs that may encourage or discourage, basically changing the incentives of women to work or not. Taxes, of course, that can hinder you if you have less money in your pocket. And that also changes the incentives of whether to work or not. And the labor market regulations can almost directly influence those decisions whether or not to work. Whenever you're looking at some of this for women and for the dignity of work and all this, how this goes together, how can this also be rounded the circle, close the circle, if you will, for the amount of time at home, and you were just talking about this some, but with kids and everything else. And it seems like, Meg, and I may be wrong about this just because I work from home, my wife works from home, and I do a lot more with our kids. And I love that opportunity where, the man, the quote unquote man, if you will, is not just going to work, but also more engaged with their kids and having more time with the family and everything else. And I wonder if, is this really just the NatCons that are pushing back on some of this? Or are there more opportunities for us to not only be, to prosper materially, but the way that I like to think about prosperity is much more holistic. Whenever it's thinking about your family, society, mentally, psychologically, there's a lot more that goes along with prosperity than just the material. That's important, but it's not the whole thing. But I wonder what some of your thoughts are on that, and some of maybe the pushback that you've seen so far.
Yeah, I think my first response would be, I don't know how different people's definition of prosperity varies. I want to give people an environment in which they can pursue their own definition of prosperity. And so that's one big reason why I push for this economic freedom solution to so many problems is I want people to be free to pursue their own vision here. And I really do think that the way that we've pursued modern economics in many ways has done us a disservice is we focus on like the atomistic individual, when in fact, so many of the decisions we make are decisions that have to do with our family, or, our small groups. And so, I think what I would say is economic freedom gives people the flexibility to pursue their own definition of prosperity. And when you mention, it is a difficult balance figuring out, the sort of, I don't want to say we've talked about work leisure trade-off in economics, but I think work family trade-off is so difficult. And I do really fundamentally believe that some of our policies are making that trade-off much more difficult. And one thing I like to point to is, you say which parts of economic freedom matter in many ways. I think the labor market regulations are so tricky here. And the Institute for Justice does a wonderful job of bringing this to light in their license to work publication. And one of the most female heavy and most regulated occupations is childcare. And so, we have all of these, again, you go to the mandate versus economic freedom discussion here. It's easy to see we've got a big public conversation about, paid childcare and why more women can't, afford to go into the labor market. Well, if you are regulating childcare providers so heavily, that makes fewer providers and the ones that are there much more expensive. And that makes the trade-off not difficult for people who are already wealthy and can afford the childcare. That makes the trade-off really, really difficult for people who are maybe families who are on the border of being able to have a mom work and not work. And so that's why I would push for economic freedom in that sphere.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And so, Meg, for thinking about the policymakers that are listening and influencers that are listening, where are some places to start? Because it can be a little bit, there's so many different factors, right? It can almost be a little overwhelming at times. But I wonder, where are some good places maybe to start where you start to tinker and then really open up as much economic freedom as possible?
Absolutely. I don't want to what's the word that I'm looking for? I don't have the hubris to think that I know exactly where to start. And I often talk in terms of an order of operations. There are probably some things that we need to deal with that were going to be easier to deal with before we deal with those more intractable things. There are a couple things that I would say. Taxes and government spending, even though we include them separately in our index, are the flip side of one another, right? We tax in order to spend. And so policy discussions that divorce those two are really problematic. I loved when Trump cut my taxes, it was wonderful. But without dealing with the beast of government spending, that's leaving us, that's just kicking the can down the road. Me and my children will be paying for that into the future. And so having those conversations together, and really, I don't know, one of the projects that we have at the Bridwell Institute is we teach high school teachers how to teach economics from a free market perspective. And as a matter of fact, Vance, I think you some of the stuff for that. I did a taxation and public finance unit with Dean Stansel for that. And I think it is kind of difficult, but so important to teach that those are the flip side, because I don't think students understand. Like high school students
Mm-hmm.
don't really understand because we have these conversations isolated from one another. What are those taxes ultimately getting you? Is it worth it? When we make these decisions, spending income decisions as a family, it's easy to see the relationship between what you're getting for your money
Yeah.
and is it really valuable to you? We have divorced that sort of conversation in the public sphere. And so I think that would be a good, first step for policymakers to really, but they don't have the incentive to do that, right?
Right.
Like there's no incentive for them to do that. So I kind of sometimes like to say I've got like my imaginary world where I would love for these conversations to be had together. And then my public choice, I'm a realist world.
Yeah.
Where I say, well, but what really are their incentives to have these conversations? I think the other big point that I would say is we need to be better advocates for selling economic freedom. If policymakers aren't going to have those conversations on their own, we need to package the economic freedom conversation in a way that makes it, easier for politicians to sell them.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is one reason why various progressive ideologies are starting to take hold is because they've got good selling points. It's easy to say, hey, there's poverty in the world. Here is a program to help alleviate this poverty. College debt is getting out of control. Here's a debt forgiveness program or a free college for all program. Like the logic is so linear. We don't have that linear logic, but I think we could make it an easier sell. And so by drawing out all of those connections between economic freedom and these beneficial outcomes, and it's tough. You mentioned the seen and the unseen earlier. It's tough to draw out those unseen consequences. But I think doing that in a way that could help policymakers actually sell it to their constituents would go a long way in making it more palatable and effective.
Yeah, and I agree. So many good points there, Meg. And when you think about whether it's the $35 trillion in national debt or some of the excess spending in Texas, there's some things that need to be reformed there as well. There are always ways to get government out of the way and allow for the market to work and have more economic freedom. And then ultimately for us to be able to prosper, whether you're men or women or kids or adults, we should have that ability. And fortunately, we live in America where we do have more of that than many other places across the globe. But I'm so glad that you and others are pushing the envelope a little bit more because we need more of it. There's still a little bit too much socialism. There's too big a government, even in America, that I think are holding us back. And from your research, we've been able to tell a lot of that story. So as we're closing up here, though, Meg, I want to give you opportunity to say anything else that you want for the audience, and we'll leave it there.
Just a couple of small things. Theworld.com, wonderful name for a website. That's where you can find that data on economic freedom at the cross state or the cross country level. It's got this really cool interactive interface where you can, watch how your state has evolved over time in terms of economic freedom and then dig into the data if you want to. So that's a good place to find that. The Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom, where I am at Southern Methodist University. If you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we have wonderful events throughout the year. So definitely check us out there. And the Policy Circle, who sort of helped fund some of this research. That is a female-oriented discussion group that is really, really cool. The sort of premise is that women don't participate as fully in policy discussions as men do. But if you have these discussions at sort of the with your friends or family or coworkers, maybe you'll be more empowered to participate in those discussions, out in the real world. So those are a couple of good places. And then if you want to know more about the specific 15 papers, the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom, we don't have like a catchy, URL, but if you just Google Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom, all of those working papers are available on our website. So we looked at everything. I mean, I kept the call for papers really broad.
Yeah.
Looked at entrepreneurship. They looked at, whether economic freedom is good for family formation, if it's good for, female educational outcomes, like a broad variety of things. And so if you want to know more about that, you can check that out at our website.
That's awesome. And I'm guessing that for the most part, it is. Economic freedom is helpful for all those things, right?
It's helpful for all those things. There was not a single paper.
Nice.
And we didn't, we just said, hey, we're going to commission this and I'm going to have my hands out of the research. You just run with it. So, every single paper found that economic freedom was beneficial for women's outcomes in a variety of ways and Claudia Williamson at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and Colin O'Reilly at Creighton are doing another round of these papers because it was so overwhelmingly popular of a project. And so hoping in the future to find more of those cool outcomes.
Awesome. That's fantastic, Meg. Thank you for all you're doing, and may God bless you and your family.
Great. Thanks, Vance.
Thank you, Meg. For the audience, I told you we were going to have a great discussion. Hope you learned a lot. I'm going to put all the show notes on this and some links at vanceginn.substack.com, or you can just go to vanceginn.com and find that as well. And this was, again, another great discussion. Thank you for joining us. Go out and give us a 5-star rating. Share it with your friends and family. They need to know a little bit about economic freedom as well. And until next time, let people prosper.